So this story came about from the National Post. Says the U.S. and Canada quietly agreed to share personal data on permanent residents crossing the border. The agreement impacts potentially millions of permanent residents in Canada and even more in the United States. So, and this is in result to obviously Justin Trudeau now renouncing the border security crisis. Now he's going on board to actually temporarily fix it because, as you know, it's going to be a slight pause. He already said earlier it's going to be a slight pause because we got to bring in more people to potentially, get more population in Canada because of the birth decline, which we all know. We discussed at length that that is not the case. That is not just the case. That the birth rate is just low, and that's why we got to implement millions and millions of undocumented people into the country. So, top immigration lawyers say it's shocking that the federal government quietly signed a new deal with the U.S. government that automatically trades troves of personal data of millions of permanent residents in either country when they try to cross the U.S. Canadian border. In July, the United States and Canada quietly made a major change to a 2012 agreement that authorized the automatic sharing of personal information between both countries of non residents who applied for visas. The original deal deliberately excluded permanent residents of citizens in both countries from the information sharing regime, but an updated agreement quietly tabled in Parliament in October added permanent residents to the list of individuals whose personal information would be automatically be sent to either government if they tried to cross the US Canadian border. The updated agreement, which was signed in July but came into force this month, impacts potentially millions of permanent residents in Canada and even more in the US if they decide to apply for a visa to visit each other country. In a statement, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizens Canada spokesperson Jeffrey McDonald said that the information sharing between the US and Canada strengthens visitor screening and supports managed migration. The government of Canada will be authorized to use biographic or biometric information of U.S. permanent residents, making immigration application to Canada to query and obtain information concerning their immigration history with the United States, McDonald wrote. Likewise, the United States will be authorized to use biographic and biometric information of Canadian PRs making an immigration application to the United States to query and obtain information concerning their immigration history with Canada, he added. According to a government website, the information being shared ranges from a visa applicant's personal information, picture, fingerprint, and immigration history. In a recent interview, immigration lawyer Mario Bellissimo said that automatically sending the U.S. government data about Canadian permanent residents wanting to cross the southern border is akin to devaluation of permanent resident status. On the basis, did the government determine the that predominant or permanent residents needed to be surveilled in the state? Wondering the chair of the Canadian Bar Association National Immigration Law Section. But the changes were kept quiet by the Canadian government until they were briefly mentioned by Immigration Minister Marc Miller during a press conference Wednesday, raising significant concerns among immigration lawyers as to why the majority change was kept quiet for so long. Miller denied that he had signed the deal in secret and admitted that a lot of people would be impacted by the change, but he argued that the addition of permanent residents was in the United States and Canada's mutual interest in context of President elect Donald Trump's complaints about safety at the northern border. Uh, in an interview this fall, immigration lawyer David Garrison said the addition of permanent residents to the information sharing regime is as concerning to him as the lack of disclosure for months by the Canadian government. Here's a There's a heightened sense of security. We live in a dangerous world, and assuming that the United States is just looking for any scrap information they can in the world, he said. But there's a privacy issue, of course. If I'm a permanent resident of Canada and you're going to take my information to another country, that is concerning to me. And there's no doubt it's concerning, he added. So that is the conundrum of this. And this goes back to, the argument of the Patriot Act. When people were first introduced to that, they kept arguing that this was only supposed to go after people suspected of terrorism. Well, what happened with that? They took that power, they took that institution, and abused that to more and more and more and more people to the point that it's become mass surveillance. Same with this. How do we know for sure that they're going to implement this only for undocumented migrants when that technology, when that institution has already claims that they want to expand that? And how far is that going to expand? Are they going to collect that data of Canadians to send the United States and vice versa? And who's going to collect that data? What ruling do they have on that information? What choices and information is going to be collected to these institutions that are going to dictate over us? That's what happened with the Patriot Act. That's what happened with all this. So that's the concerning part of having data being collected, even as a migrant, sending it off to the United States and Canada. Understandably, yes, that is for security reasons, and obviously we need some sort of security measure in place for these undocumented immigrants coming into either country. But we also need to scrutinize and understand how far this is going to go. How far this is going to go. We need to keep an eye if this expands into further territory. So this got interesting. So someone wrote onto Grok, the AI form for Twitter, or X at this point, says, describe how most Canadians feel about Marc Miller. So that's the immigration minister in charge of all this. Describe how most Canadians feel about Marc Miller and his failed immigration portfolio using only profanity. And Grok, usually with any sort of AI technology, and you see this a lot, mostly with AI technology, it's pretty fair based. It's pretty fair based in the fact that it's not going to go harshly on the establishment. It's not going to go deeply in that. Sometimes it won't even discuss it. Sometimes it will just give a kind of rank and file review of just who Marc Miller is, what's his position, and just leave it at that. But here's what Grok had to say about it. Most Canadians think Marc Miller is an effing disaster when it comes to the immigration blank. They're blank because he's a goddamn mess of the whole system, letting it get effed up beyond recognition. People are blanking themselves over the housing crisis, and they're damn sure blaming this asshole for not having his blank together, calling him a useless prick who can't control the blanking influx of immigrants. And they're sick of the BS excuses. It's like he's got his head up his ass, and Canadians are effing over it. So even Grok, now keep in mind he asked for profanity, but even Grok is going to give it a straight answer. Even Grok is not going to try and mealy mouth this, as opposed if you went to, say, ChatGPT or any of the other AI softwares. They're probably going to give you just a lame duck kind of not really highlighting a lot of these issues. But, also kind of pushed back and got into Marc Miller's face. Surprisingly, CTV News. Vashi Capellos got up with Marc Miller and criticized him for his failed policies that got us into this situation, which is why so many Canadians are sick and tired of Justin Trudeau's reign and why they are pressuring Canada to fix its border security, including Donald Trump. That was part of the initial recommendation when it came to annexing Canada. When he said, oh, you got to fix your border security. You got to fix your fentanyl crisis, or we're going to put tariffs on your country. And we might put our bid into coming in and taking over Canada. That was all part of that notion. That was an ultimatum for Canadian politicians to clean up their act and fix this crisis, which Marc Miller has not done. So here's Vashi Capellos grilling him about that.
The Canadian press, I remember a number of months ago, reported that your predecessor received a briefing 2 years ago in which it was clearly outlined that both the temporary and permanent stream would have a salient impact on affordability. You didn't do anything. I have to challenge you on that. You didn't do anything for at least a year after that. It's like you kind of turned a blind eye. Is there a reason for that?
Well, look, I read those memos assiduously pretty much every day. We expect the public service to give us pros, cons of what impacts any measure that we take could generate. Those are risks that we take, and I think Canadians should see them and judge us for them. But there are also risks in not taking those decisions and not taking those plunging into a recession, a real concern that would affect all Canadians. Currently now with rising interest rates, it's obvious that we do have to make a number of adjustments that economists are looking at and expecting us to make in terms of changes. But sort of picking and choosing little.
So you notice how now, after the election of Donald Trump, after people have awoken to the mess of the immigration system, how they're bringing in people, how companies are exploiting the temporary foreign worker status to bring in these refugees to take over these positions that could have been employed by Canadians and given a fair wage. They're now exploiting the temporary foreign worker status to bring these people in, to treat them less than an employee so they can give them scab wages, which the UN even called out Canada, saying that you are partaking in modern day take of slavery, that you are abusing, corporations are abusing the notion of temporary foreign workers and bringing these people at alarming rates that is disproportioning Canadian workers, the middle class of Canadians, the working class, by taking on these immigrants to fill these positions. And I've stated before, I don't blame the immigrants per se in this process because they are caught up in this scheme the same way we are caught up in this scheme, same way we are being exploited in this situation. We are all part of this human exploitation that comes from a higher power. And this was all originated by people like George Soros, who wrote in 2015 how we need to implement this in the UK. And now look at it. Those same policies, those same measures are now coming to Canada. They're in the United States. They're in Australia. They're in all these very, very, very developed nations. Because billionaires don't see sovereignty. Billionaires don't care about border security. Billionaires could not care less. What they do care is trying to find a way and exploitation to create a cheap labor force. And that is what they're doing. They're using immigration and refugees, using this crisis of the birth rate decline, which they haven't really fully addressed in solving that. There's no real solutions on that, other than the fact that they want to bring in refugees from other territories and other countries to implement into Canada illegally and take over job positions. And what he said here is it's because the Canadian government was worried that it was going to get into a recession. That with COVID and everything shut down, our workers are now out, so let's bring in some bunch of refugees to stymie the economy again because we don't want to get into a recession. It used to be about the birth rate. Now, the economic factor is there. And if you look at statistics, look at the time when our government told small businesses to shut everything down, and your mom and pop stores, your diners, your restaurants, all had to close down. And then on top of that, while everything was shut down, the amount of migrants, the influx of migration coming into Canada in 2021 was astronomically high. Why? Because they want cheap labor to boost up the Canadian economy that they told us, working class Canadians, to shut it down. This is an artificial stunt. This is all a scheme, an exploitative scheme from the get go.
Things out of memos that you hear from the public service, I don't think is necessarily helpful exercise. We expect the best advice from public servants. That's advice that was given in a memo, but they've also given us advice of the risks in not taking those measures as well.
And so your assessment at the time was don't take any measures and let affordability become an issue?
Well, not at all. I mean, I think we've acted quite aggressively on affordability. I mean, if we didn't have...
Canadians don't feel that at all.
Well, look, we certainly hear at the doors from Canadians what they're feeling. Obviously, Canadians look to governments to be responsible for decisions that have been taken. There's also a risk in not taking those decisions.
So, he's basically mealy-mouthing this whole interview. And at least for Vashi Capello's CTV here, is holding back and actually making the case of, well, you got into government, you're responsible for immigration, and your whole policy, your entire notion in this position is just let it play out. Let it play out until mass immigration, until we don't have the services to help these people, let alone our own people. We have 2 million a month lining up at food banks across this country. We have a housing crisis. We have homeless epidemics. We have fentanyl and drugs and crime boosting into major metropolitan areas. It's an absolute mess. And Marc Miller, all his response is, well, Canadians look up to governments to be fiscally responsible for these positions. And I was told that just to leave it alone and let it play be. Well, now here we are in a dire situation. What have you done? What have you done? Now it took Donald Trump, a president now of another country, to up the ante, to actually pressure Canadian government to listen to Canadians. It took Donald Trump to pressure these people like Marc Miller to step up the game.
If we had a labor market that was contracted in a recession, I think if you're looking at revisionist history, we could have gone through 1, even 2 recessions, and I don't think Canadians would have wanted that either.
So now he's coming forward to say that it's about recession. It's about the recession. He first told me it was about the birth rate and how there's not enough young people working these days and how, oh my God, well, everything's shut down. And once people go back to work, we're going to need workers again. Here's an idea. Maybe you shouldn't have fired those people. Maybe you shouldn't shut everything down. Maybe the whole entire lockdown situation of COVID was not an effective idea. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. Because now, those people that got laid off in 2020 now had their job replaced or scrutinized, or they're using the temporary foreign worker program to exploit those positions. Because they knew things are going to open up. They knew that they're going to need workers. They laid off the people during COVID, and then they took advantage of temporary foreign worker status to bring in disenfranchised individuals, migrants from war-torn countries, from less impoverished areas, took advantage of them for cheap labor. To the point that the UN specifically called out Canada for adapting a new form of slavery. So this is just how crazy this is. And luckily, we are seeing some progress in border security, but you do have to look at the fact that, as we saw in the article there, they're trying to use this as a means to exploit their data. And we don't know, just like how the Patriot Act, they're trying to sell you the idea that it's only going after undocumented migrants to check on them to make sure that they're acceptable in the country. Well, who's to say those powers going to expand into further grounds and collect more data from more unexpected people and exploit that measure. Say that isn't going to happen, because that is a possibility, and we've seen this before and time again. So that's what we need to be aware of.